Time of death, 11:47 p.m. The doctor said it like he had said it 100 times before. Clinical. Practiced. The kind of voice that has learned to separate itself from the meaning of its own words, because if it did not, it would break. He pulled the sheet up to the man's chin, removed his gloves, and walked out of the room without looking back. And just like that, Dominic Salerno was dead. Or so every single person in that hospital believed. Now, I need you to pay very close attention to what I am about to tell you. Because there is something happening inside that room, beneath that sheet, behind those closed eyelids, that no one knows about yet. Not the doctor, not the nurses, not the 12 men in dark suits standing in the hallway with faces made of concrete and grief. Not the woman sitting in the chapel downstairs, rocking back and forth, whispering prayers into her own hands. Nobody knows, but you will. And once you do, you will understand why everything that happened in the next 48 hours turned a funeral into a resurrection and a resurrection into a war. Let me take you back 6 hours. Dominic Salerno ran the Eastern Seaboard. Not officially, not on paper. On paper, he was a logistics consultant, a businessman, a philanthropist who donated to children's hospitals and attended charity galas and smiled for photographs with mayors and councilmen who needed his money more than they needed their integrity. But beneath the paper, beneath the suits and the donations and the handshakes, Dominic Salerno controlled a network so vast and so deeply threaded into the infrastructure of the city that removing him would have been like removing the foundation from a skyscraper. Everything above would collapse. He was 51 years old. He was built like a man who had spent his 20s doing physical violence and his 30s learning that other people could do it for him. His hair was dark. His eyes were darker. And his voice, when he spoke, made rooms adjust. Not because he was loud, because he was precise. Every word he said meant exactly what it said, and the people around him had learned that the distance between his words and his actions was zero. 6 hours before the doctor pulled that sheet up, Dominic had been sitting in the back of his restaurant in Red Hook, Brooklyn, eating spaghetti with his underboss, a man named Victor Costello, and discussing something that Victor clearly did not want to discuss. The Koreans are moving on the port, Victor had said. Let them move. Dom, if they take the port. I said let them move. I want to see where they go. You learn more from watching a man run than from stopping him. That was Dominic. Patient. Strategic. The kind of man who played chess while everyone around him played checkers, and who never let anyone see the board. But someone had seen the board. Because at 5:58 p.m. that evening, as Dominic walked from his restaurant to his car, he collapsed. No warning. No sound. No dramatic clutching of the chest. He simply stopped walking, stood still for half a second as if he had remembered something, and then folded to the ground like a building that had been quietly demolished from the inside. His men rushed him to the hospital. Not a public hospital. A private facility in Manhattan where the doctors knew who he was and understood that discretion was not a preference, but a condition of continued breathing. The doctors worked on him for 4 hours. They said it was cardiac arrest. They said it was sudden. They said they did everything they could. They said he did not respond. They said he was gone. And here is where I need to ask you something. Do you believe them? Because I am telling you right now, there is something wrong with this story. Something the doctors missed. Something that was not in the blood work or the monitors or the charts. And I need you to stay with me. Because the moment you find out what it is, you will understand why I told you to pay attention from the very first line. The news spread through the organization like fire through dry wood. Within 2 hours, every captain, every lieutenant, every soldier in Dominic Salerno's network knew. The boss was gone. Calls were made. Alliances were recalculated. Men who had been loyal for decades began making phone calls to men they should not have been calling. Because that is what happens when a king falls. The board resets. And everyone who has been waiting for their chance begins to move. Victor Costello took control. Temporarily, he said. Out of respect. Out of necessity. He stood in the hallway of the hospital with his hands clasped and his face arranged in the appropriate mask of sorrow, and told the men that Dominic would be honored, that the family would remain strong, that nothing would change. But things were already changing. And Victor knew it. Because Victor had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Now here is the part one need you to lean in for. Dominic had a daughter. Her name was Elena. She was 28, sharp, educated, and deliberately kept away from the business. Dominic had built a wall between his world and hers so high and so thick that Elena knew her father as a businessman, a widower, a man who worked too much and loved her in the quiet, clumsy way that powerful men love their children, with protection instead of presence. But Dominic also had someone else, a child, a boy, 4 years old, and almost nobody knew he existed. Stay with me. Subscribe right now, because this child is the reason the dead man's hand is going to move. And when you find out whose child he is, you are going to need to sit down. The boy's name was Marco. He had dark eyes, dark hair that curled behind his ears, small hands that were always reaching for things, doorknobs, shirt buttons, the edges of tables, as if the world was something he needed to confirm through touch, because no one had yet convinced him it was permanent. Marco was not supposed to be at the hospital. He was not supposed to be anywhere near this situation. He was supposed to be in a small apartment in Astoria, Queens, with a woman named Ada, who was his mother, who was the secret that Dominic Salerno had kept locked in a vault so deep inside his life that only 2 people on Earth knew about it. Dominic and Victor. Let that sit for a moment. Victor knew about the boy. Victor knew about Ada. Victor knew about the apartment in Astoria. Remember that, because it matters more than anything else I have told you so far. Ada had received the call at 7 p.m., not from Victor, from a nurse at the hospital who had found her number in Dominic's phone under a contact listed simply as A. The nurse had broken protocol because she had heard Ada's voicemail greeting and heard a child laughing in the background and made a human decision that protocol could not account for. She called and she said, "I think you should come." Ada came. She brought Marco because there was no one else to watch him. She arrived at the hospital at 9:30 p.m., moving through the corridors like a ghost, unseen by the men in suits because they did not know her face, unrecognized by the staff because she had never been listed as family, invisible because Dominic had built her invisibility with the same meticulous care he applied to everything he wanted to protect. She found the room. She stood outside the door and looked through the glass and saw him lying on the bed, still, gray, the monitors flat, the sheet pulled to his chin. She did not scream. She did not collapse. She pressed her hand against the glass and made a sound that was quieter than crying and more devastating. The sound of a woman whose grief has no audience because her love was never allowed to be public. Marco tugged at her hand. "Mama, why are we here?" "We are here to see someone, baby." "Who?" She did not answer. She pushed open the door. She walked into the room. It was cold the way hospital rooms are cold, not from temperature but from absence, from the sudden removal of the thing that had made the room matter. She stood beside the bed. She looked at Dominic's face. She touched his cheek. It was cool. Not cold. Cool. And something about that registered in a place beneath her conscious mind, a place where instinct lives and logic has not yet arrived. But she did not act on it. She was too deep inside her grief to think. Marco stood on his tiptoes. He could barely see over the edge of the bed. He looked at the man lying there. The man he knew only as the person who came to their apartment on Tuesday and Thursday nights, who read him stories, who smelled like coffee and wool, who lifted him onto his shoulders and called him little man, in a voice that was different from the voice the rest of the world heard. "Mama, is he sleeping?" "Yes, baby. He is sleeping. Can I hold his hand?" Ada looked at her son. She looked at the man on the bed. She had been told he was gone. The doctor had said it. The machines confirmed it. There was nothing to hold on to except a hand that could not hold back. "Yes," she whispered. "You can hold his hand." She lifted Marco up. She sat him on the edge of the bed. The boy reached out with his small fingers and wrapped them around Dominic's right hand, the hand that had built an empire, the hand that had signed death warrants and written checks, and held the little boy's face while telling him he was loved. Marco held that hand the way children hold things, with total commitment, with the earnest belief that holding on is enough. That grip alone can keep the world from taking what it wants. "Wake up," Marco said. "Please wake up. You said you would take me to the park. You promised." The room was silent. The monitors were dark. The air was still. And then the hand moved. Not a twitch. Not a spasm. Not the involuntary firing of a nerve that sometimes occurs in the recently deceased. This was different. This was a contraction. A closing. Dominic's fingers curled, slowly, deliberately, around Marco's small hand, and held on. Ada stopped breathing. Marco looked up at her. "Mama, he is squeezing." Ada slammed her hand on the call button. She pressed it again. And again, she screamed into the hallway. Someone get in here. Now. Right now. He is alive. He is alive. 30 seconds later, the room exploded with medical staff. Monitors were reconnected. Vitals were checked. And what the doctors found defied every conclusion they had reached 4 hours earlier. A heartbeat. Faint. Irregular. But present. A heartbeat that had not been there when they pronounced him. A heartbeat that should not have existed. Dominic Salerno was alive. But here is what the doctors did not say out loud. What they discussed in low voices in the hallway while Ada held Marco and wept, and the men in suits outside began making very different phone calls than the ones they had been making an hour ago. The cardiac arrest had not been natural. The toxicology report, rushed through at the insistence of the hospital director who understood exactly whose body was in that room, showed traces of a compound that did not belong in Dominic's blood. A compound that mimics cardiac failure. A compound that suppresses vital signs so effectively that even experienced physicians will pronounce death. A compound that wears off in 6 to 10 hours. Someone had poisoned Dominic Salerno. Not to kill him. To make the world believe he was dead. Long enough for the board to reset. Long enough for alliances to shift. Long enough for someone to take the throne while the king was lying in a hospital bed with a sheet over his face. And only 2 people had known about the apartment in Astoria. About Ada. About Marco. About the secret that could destroy Dominic's carefully separated worlds. Dominic. And Victor. Are you putting it together? Good. But before we go any further, I need you to subscribe to this channel right now. Because what Dominic does when he opens his eyes, when he finds out who did this to him, and when he discovers what Victor has already set in motion while the world thought he was gone, that is something you cannot miss. Drop a comment. Tell me what you think happens next. I promise you, you are not even close. Dominic opened his eyes at 4:17 a.m. The first thing he saw was the ceiling. White. Fluorescent. The kind of ceiling that belongs to rooms where people either begin living or stop. The second thing he saw was Ada, asleep in a chair beside his bed, her hand still resting on the mattress near his arm, her face carrying the wreckage of hours of terror even in sleep. The third thing he saw was Marco, curled against Ada's chest, his small fist still closed around nothing, still holding on to something that was no longer there. And the fourth thing Dominic saw, when he turned his head and found the force stand and the monitor and the chart clipped to the foot of his bed, was the truth. He knew before anyone told him. He knew the way men in his position know things, not through evidence, but through the accumulated instinct of 30 years spent surviving in a world where betrayal is not a possibility, but a certainty, where the only variable is timing. Someone had tried to erase him. Not with a bullet, not with a bomb, with a chemical that mimicked death so perfectly that even the doctors had signed off. Whoever did this had not wanted him dead. They had wanted him declared dead. Because a dead man cannot give orders. A dead man cannot challenge a succession. A dead man's empire is a carcass, and carcasses attract the people who have been waiting to feed. He pressed the call button. A nurse arrived. He asked for 2 things. Water and his phone. The nurse brought both. Her hands were trembling. She had been part of the team that pronounced him. She had seen the flat monitors. She had watched the sheet go up. And now the man beneath the sheet was sitting up and asking for his phone with the calm authority of someone ordering breakfast. Dominic made one call. Not to Victor. Not to any of his captains. He called Elena. His daughter answered on the second ring. Her voice was raw. She had been crying for hours. Dad. She said it like a question, like a prayer, like a word she was testing to see if the universe would still let it mean something. They told me you were, they said. I am here, Elena. Listen to me. Do not speak. Just listen. I need you to come to the hospital. Bring no one. Tell no one. Come alone. Can you do that? Dad, what is happening? Elena, can you do that? Yes. 20 minutes. He hung up. He looked at Ada. She was awake now. She had heard his voice and her eyes had opened with the sudden sharpness of a woman who had trained herself to wake at the slightest shift in her environment because her life had taught her that shifts are warnings. Dom, she said, take Marco home. Now, pack a bag. Go to your sister's place in New Haven. Do not use your phone. Do not tell anyone where you are going. I will find you when it is safe. What happened to you? He looked at her. At this woman who had loved him in secret for 5 years, who had raised his son in an apartment that existed on no document connected to his name, who had never complained about the arrangement, never pushed for more, never asked him to choose her over the empire because she understood, with the brutal clarity of a woman who sees the world as it is rather than as she wishes it were, that asking him to choose was asking him to do the one thing that would get all three of them killed. Someone tried to remove me, he said. And the person who did it knew about you. Knew about Marco. Which means you are not safe here. Fear moved across her face. Not for herself. For the boy sleeping against her chest. The primal, ungovernable fear of a mother who has just been told that the walls around her child are thinner than she believed. She did not argue. She did not ask questions. She lifted Marco, who stirred but did not wake, and she walked out of the room and out of the hospital and into the night, carrying a child who had brought his father back from the dead with nothing but a small hand and a promise about the park. Elena arrived in 18 minutes. She walked into the room and stopped. She looked at her father. She looked at the monitors, now beeping with vital signs that should not exist. She covered her mouth with both hands. How? She whispered. Sit down, Elena. She sat. He told her everything. Not just about tonight. About Ada. About Marco. About the son she did not know she had a brother. About the second life he had kept hidden because hiding it was the only way he knew to protect it. He watched her face as he spoke. He watched the shock give way to hurt. The hurt give way to anger. The anger give way to something quieter and more complicated, the expression of a woman who is realizing that the father she thought she knew was both more human and more flawed than she had ever imagined. You have a brother, Dominic said. His name is Marco. He is 4 years old. He has your grandmother's eyes. And tonight, when every doctor in this hospital said I was finished, he held my hand and told me I promised to take him to the park. And I came back. I do not know how. I do not know why. But his hand was the last thing I felt before the darkness, and the first thing I felt when the darkness let go. Elena was crying. Not with sadness. With the overwhelming weight of too many truths arriving at once. Who did this to you? She asked. Victor. The name landed in the room like a dropped blade. Elena knew Victor. She had known him her entire life. Uncle Victor. The man who brought her birthday presents. The man who stood beside her father at every gathering, every meeting, every moment of consequence. The man she had been told to call if anything ever happened to her father. How do you know? Because Victor is the only person outside this room who knew about Ada and Marco. And because Victor has wanted my seat for 15 years. He has been patient, disciplined. He waited until he found the one weapon that could remove me without a war, a chemical that would make the world grieve while he stepped into the vacuum. By the time anyone discovered the truth, he would already be in place. Alliances formed. Loyalties redirected. The transition complete. He paused. But he made one mistake. What mistake? He underestimated a 4-year-old boy. Dominic stood. He pulled the 4 from his arm. He put on the clothes that had been folded on the chair beside his bed. He moved slowly but without hesitation, the way a machine restarts. Each system coming online in sequence, not yet at full power, but operational, functional, dangerous. What are you going to do? Elena asked. I am going to walk into my own funeral. At 10 a.m. that morning, Victor Costello stood in the main hall of Dominic's estate on Long Island. The room was filled with men, captains, lieutenants, associates. The entire infrastructure of the Salerno organization gathered not for a funeral, but for what Victor had framed as a transition, a respectful, orderly transfer of leadership necessitated by tragedy. Victor stood at the front of the room. His suit was black. His expression was calibrated, somber enough to honor the dead, confident enough to reassure the living. He spoke about Dominic with the practiced reverence of a man who had rehearsed this speech many times, in private, in the dark, in the years he had spent standing one step behind the throne, measuring it, memorizing it, waiting. Dominic was more than a leader, Victor said. He was a brother, a father, a man of vision, and while no one can replace him, the double doors at the back of the hall opened. Every head turned. Dominic Salerno walked into the room. He was pale. He moved with the measured deliberation of a man whose body had been chemically shut down 12 hours ago and was running on will rather than wellness. But his eyes were alive. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had been to the place where everything ends and had come back with a clarity that the living do not possess, the clarity of someone who knows exactly what matters and exactly what does not. The room did not breathe. Victor's face underwent a transformation that would have been fascinating to study if the circumstances were less lethal. The color drained from his skin in stages, like water receding from a shore, leaving behind the pale, exposed terrain of a man whose entire plan had just collapsed in the time it took a door to open. Dominic walked forward. The crowd parted, not because he pushed through, because the men on either side of him stepped back instinctively, the way all living things step back from something that has returned from a place it should not have been able to return from. He stopped in front of Victor. The two men looked at each other. "You miscounted, Victor," Dominic said. His voice was quiet. His voice was always quiet. "You counted the doctors. You counted the drugs. You counted the hours. But you did not count the boy." Victor's mouth opened. Nothing came out. For the first time in his life, the man who had built a reputation on composure and calculation had no words, because the dead man was standing in front of him, and the dead are not supposed to speak. "My son held my hand," Dominic said. "A 4-year-old boy. He asked me to wake up. He told me I made a promise. And I am a man who keeps his promises, Victor. You should have remembered that." He turned to the room, to the men who had been calculating their futures based on his absence, to the captains who had already begun negotiating with Victor, to the soldiers who had been told the king was finished. "I am not finished," Dominic said. "And the man who tried to finish me is standing right here. You all have a choice to make. You can make it now." No one moved toward Victor. Not one person. Because whatever loyalty Victor had purchased in the 12 hours of Dominic's absence evaporated the moment the dead man walked through the door. Loyalty purchased in absence cannot survive the presence of the man it was purchased to replace. Victor was removed from the room. What happened to him after that is not something I will describe, because this story is not about vengeance. It is about something else. Something that happened 2 days later. Dominic went to the park. A small park in Astoria, Queens. Nothing special. Swings. A slide. A patch of grass where pigeons gathered with the entitled confidence of creatures who have never been at the bottom of a food chain. He sat on a bench. Marco sat beside him. The boy's feet did not touch the ground. He was eating an ice cream cone that was melting faster than he could manage, dripping down his wrist in rivers of vanilla. "You came back," Marco said. "I told you I would. Do you promise you will always come back?" Dominic looked at his son, at the dark eyes, at the small hands, at the ice cream on his chin. He looked at this boy who had reached through death and pulled him back with nothing but a grip and a grievance about an uncharged promise. "I promise," he said. And for the first time in 30 years, it was a promise he intended to keep with something other than power. He intended to keep it with presence, with Tuesdays that were not hidden, with a name the boy could carry without it being a secret, with the messy, imperfect, terrifying work of being a father in the open, in the light, where the world could see and judge and threaten. He was done hiding the only thing that had ever brought him back. Marco held out his ice cream cone. "Do you want some?" Dominic took a bite. It was too sweet. It was perfect. And behind them, Elena sat on the next bench, watching her father eat ice cream with the brother she had just learned existed, and she took out her phone and took a photograph. Not for anyone else. For herself. For proof that even men made of iron can be unmade and remade by something as small as a child's hand. And that is where this story ends. But I know you felt something. I know that somewhere in the middle of this story, you stopped scrolling because you needed to know what happened next. So do this for me. Subscribe to this channel right now. Drop a comment and tell me, what moment hit you the hardest? Was it when the hand moved? Was it when Dominic walked into his own funeral? Was it the park? Tell me. I read every single one. And share this with someone who needs to hear a story about second chances tonight. The next story is coming soon. And I promise you, it is going to be worth the wait.